All right.
This will be fun.
This will, and actually it's a real treat for me to be able to do this, to say the very least. I don't think John really needs introduction. Do I need to do that more formally? Okay, but I will say something that maybe some of you don't know. John was recently awarded, amongst many of his awards, the gold medal for France's, let me make sure I get this right, France's National Defense Gold Medal, right, for what he has done in terms of helping the country with its digitization and what it's doing for its future. And we're going to spend a little bit of time about that because that really is something that's been so important in terms of your belief. And let me kick off and also tell you, although you might know a ton about John, you probably don't know these following things about John, which he was willing to share.
This is always nervous.
But he at least was willing to share this. So first of all, he's married to his high school sweetheart. I mean, really? Come on. I mean, seriously, yeah. He likes to duck hunt and fly fish. And here's my personal favorite, which is, John's been spending a lot of time with startups and really been able to give them some of the wisdom that he's been able to accrue over the years. But he recently decided to really work with a startup that's developing robotics. Wait for it, for cricket farming. So there you go. All right, so let's go ahead and start. And with all frankness, John, the digitization and disruption, you have seen this for years, and you've really fundamentally believed that this is something that can transform countries. And in this geopolitical environment, I mean, talk a little bit about your vision on digitization and why it's so important.
Well, like many of us in this room, and I always try to cater my comments to the group and say, if I were sitting in your position, what would I want to know on key elements? We all understand that digitization is now taking off, but when we started focusing on 8 years ago, people couldn't even pronounce it on TV even 3 years ago. And the concept's amazing, going from 1,000 devices connected to the internet when Cisco was found to 500 billion devices connected to the internet in the next 10 years. But it isn't the connectivity of the issue, it's how it's going to transform every aspect of our lives, every business process, how it's going to have tremendous opportunity and inclusionary opportunities, tremendous disruption. And so when you bring it back to a country level, you begin to see countries that may shock you, like a France and an India leading. One that will not shock you at all is Israel. Israel was the first digital country. Both political parties got it. Prior President Shimon Peres, who's a very, very good friend and somebody I miss terribly, and Prime Minister Netanyahu understood this isn't about politics. It was about transforming a country, getting GDP growth, leveraging the one major asset that we have in Israel, which is the intellectual capability and the hardworking capability of the people, that would transform the lives of every Israeli and make it inclusive, not just for the Jewish population, but for the Christian population, the Arab population, and not just in Tel Aviv or the key cities, but in Eastern Negev, etc. Bottom line, it can really make a difference of incrementally 1 to 3% growth in a country. It can make a difference in an India of perhaps instead of 1,000,001 new jobs a month, 1,000,005 new jobs a month. Israel, the number is 420,000 we thought we could get over a 10-year period from this. Transform security and everything else. It is the primary driver of almost all the technology changes that we're talking about at this conference, in my opinion, the underlying fabric.
Yeah, and what I loved when we were having a little bit of a conversation is how you talked about why it's a riser of the middle class too, and which brings a type of prosperity to a country overall.
It can be very much inclusive. And if you watch how Israel, as an example, did it from the beginning, it was designed so that it would include all the population within the country, but also inclusive of the rural areas or the less prosperous areas. And the same thing was done in India. If you say, well, John, Israel is natural, innovative, I can understand, but will this apply to other countries? You can imagine what Prime Minister Modi is doing, and he might be the best leader in my lifetime if he can execute on his vision. But he views that he can bring this capability to 1.3 billion people in the country, that they can incrementally go from 1.1 million jobs a month, new jobs, to 1.5, that he can bring broadband capability at $2.40 per month, 10 to 15 megs, that will transform healthcare education to every citizen. That he can do what Israel has done for decades, being a startup nation across his whole country. And he can do it in the well-to-do states and not so well-to-do. That he can double the per capita income conservatively every 10 years, probably every 7 years. And he is moving with the pace to become a digital manufacturing powerhouse, a startup powerhouse, the example for the rest of the world. So you're seeing this start to really take off everywhere. Important takeaway, there is no entitlement. Just because a country or a region led in prior generations of innovation does not mean you'll lead in the future. And that's very important for Israel to know, very important for the US to know. And for those of you who get too comfortable, let me make you really uncomfortable. How many of you remember Boston, 128? It was the Silicon Valley of the world, wasn't it? 1,000 high-tech startups. How many are left today of major impact? One, and he just got bought by Dell. So if the pace of the first phase of the internet was fast, this one is 3 to 5 times faster. Tremendous opportunity, but tremendous challenges.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about your involvement in Israel. And we've got a number of corporations and investors in the audience.
Yes.
I'm curious, you've invested over $2 billion, meaning Cisco's invested over $2 billion in Israel over the last decade or so. And this is through acquisitions, direct or indirect investments. Why Israel, number one? Mm-hmm. And two, how do you, when you talk about Israel and knowing that so many here are from Israel, what advice would you give folks, knowing that you want to go partner with folks there?
Okay. So if you really look at what we've done as a company in Israel, Israel was the first location all the way back to, I think, about 1996, where we did remote R&D efforts in the country. It was also the first acquisition that we did outside of our country, and I did 180 of them as CEO, probably 2/3 of which worked, and the industry only about 10% work in terms of really getting the economic benefit.
That was early in the
cycle,
right?
And it has again and again been a nation that we found innovation on. We also found that there was a loyalty and a trust that often doesn't exist with a lot of startups around the world. But what amazed me more than anything else is what I think Shimon Peres represented to me, which is a nation that recreates itself, that is tremendously innovative, that has constantly worrying about we aren't moving fast enough, and if we don't, we'll get left behind. And I've seen that again and again in the approach. So $2.1 billion in investment, much more to come in the future, but it's because of that innovation nation with a culture that truly knows how to partner and how do you create a win-win type environment. Israel was the first digital country in terms of true architecture implementation. And again, it's not about political parties, it's about inclusion. So it's an example of a country that can be a model for the rest of the world. And then we took what we learned in Israel, and candidly, we did it in France of all places. How many of you view France as a great place to invest?
Innovate.
I'm sorry, I can't see any hands
And innovate, right?
All right, do you know what was the number one country in Europe, including Israel, to invest in high-tech startups this last year? France. 486 high-tech startups funded by VCs. The year before, 230. The year before that, 130. A country that would be the last place I would have thought about developing a business or investing resources just 4 years ago, and tremendously changed. Now, what was the interesting point is when I came to Israel a couple months ago, and I shared that with your Prime Minister, and he said, John, is this really right? Is France moving faster than what we've seen before? And what you're saying is Israel has to move even faster than we are. And I said, absolutely. He called his chief of staff, and he said, is what John's saying makes sense? And he said, I get it. And he changed.
It's remarkable because with the employment laws in France, you think about that, how have they done it? And they seem to have done it for folks under 50 employees or less. And so that cultivation of innovation with those startups,
Well, they had a similar problem, only much worse than Israel. In France, once you got to 50 people, you hit all the social obligations for your workforce, which is a nice way of saying every startup stopped at 48 and went to the U.S. And while in Israel we've been much more successful on startups and much more successful at medium companies, we still have a ways to go to create what I call the major big players, and I think that will happen over time. But they were willing to revisit everything. It was a socialistic government that made these decisions and outlined a vision that shocked me. And then they moved with a speed that I'd never seen in government before. All 6 major ministries gave digitization plans, aligned with Cisco, announced it in the press with an American company after Snowden and everything else that occurred, and a trust factor. And so you see nations moving that you would have never guessed before. So when you think about the future, it's about getting market transitions right, knowing there's no entitlement. And while Israel, the U.S. should lead in these next generations, it's not guaranteed unless we have the courage to change.
And I think your message of no entitlement is remarkable because, particularly for Israel, you've got your reputation of startup nation. You have incredible entrepreneurs. You've seen the ecosystem really build up. You've seen some fantastic exits, not to mention the most recent one, where you're really over the $1 billion exits now. But there is no entitlement, and that's what we're learning more and more with digitization. Let's turn this around just a little bit.
Okay.
So everyone says Israel can learn from Silicon Valley, and everyone comes to Silicon Valley to do some learning. Yet, what could Silicon Valley learn from Israel and Israel entrepreneurs? Because Silicon Valley is middle-aged now, right?
Now, we aren't talking about age on this panel.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, but to your point, if I were to draw a parallel very quickly, very few companies in high tech stay on top of an industry for more than 10 years, and they usually fade. And you can count the number of high tech companies that have ever done that in history probably on one hand. Cisco has done it for almost 30 years in our category,
Yep.
and our average market share is 50% in everything we go after,
Wow.
which has not been equaled across 18 major product areas. But what we had to do was constantly reinvent itself. As leader and CEO for 20 of those years, I had to reinvent myself probably 5 or 6 different times. So I think what Silicon Valley can learn from Israel is a country that reinvents itself constantly, that is making Andy Grove and Only the Paranoid Survive look like he's relaxed, that there's a healthy attitude that the crisis is upon us, and if we don't move constantly, we've got to change. And when you tell a prime minister of the startup nation that you aren't moving fast enough, instead of saying, John, you're wrong, he says to his staff, is this right? And if so, what do we have to do better? And then says, when you talk to 100 of the CEOs of the startups later today, you've got to really drive that home. And then he has the courage to make the change and to do that across. So Israel, what I think the Valley can learn is this country constantly reinvents itself. It moves to the next phase of technology. It doesn't stay on the prior phase. And I could share with you so many comments that Shimon Peres taught me over 18 years of knowing the man, and I love him. But he taught me early on to think like a teenager. Don't think like a middle-aged person. And don't think linearly, because linear is what made GE great, and it really did. But the enemy of GE now is linear thinking. It's exponential thinking what's really possible and doing the impossible and constantly challenging yourself on it.
And we
so
are.
many things we can. If you watch, Israel continuously reinvents itself. You look at where most of the companies are in this room, it's around cloud, it's around security, it's around Internet of Things, it's around digitization. It's about how this whole new movement will completely transform every business from healthcare, like the prior speaker was talking about, moving forward. This country reinvents itself. So I think Silicon Valley can learn that. If Silicon Valley doesn't learn it, we'll be like 128 in Boston. My company, Wang, Dr. Wang was the smartest man I've ever met in my life, and I've met a lot of really unbelievable people. 32,000 jobs go on in the company, but so did every one of his competitors. We did not reinvent ourselves in Boston. We got too insular. We were too comfortable. We were entitled because we were leading, the high-tech leader of the world. What do you mean we aren't leading anymore? We were in denial.
So leadership is a topic area that is just so comfortable to you. You've been recognized as one of the best leaders so many times, it's, uncountable at this point.
She's being very gentle. I've also at times been accused of not being a very good leader, and that's part of leadership. You have to reinvent yourself.
I crossed that part out.
I like to talk on the positives.
I crossed that part out. I didn't decide not to go there. But with all frankness, I mean, everybody wants to learn from someone who's had the experience and has had that dynamic leadership. How much is leadership and culture truly important to innovation? And you were teasing at it with regards to when you think you're so good and you're so big and you're entitled, how do you transform the culture to be receptive to the kind of innovation and disruption that is constantly happening?
Okay. It's a really good topic you could probably spend 20 minutes on, but let me take a crack at it. There's nothing that teaches you how to reinvent yourself like your failures and your setbacks. And I would argue those of us in this room who have great companies or are fortunate enough to be a good leader, you probably were developed more by how you handled your challenges than your successes. And so having going through that and watched what occurred in Boston, Wang Laboratories, watched before that IBM, I was part of IBM, and they were on top of the world, and then it took them 2 decades to even come back, and they're a shadow of what they once were on a global basis. And then I watched my home state of West Virginia, chemical center of the world, great engineers.
Right.
We lost the leadership, never came back from it. Once you've seen that, you know you have to move. So in my opinion, I learned the leadership from my dad, a doctor who actually was a very good businessman, and see trends 10, 15 years out. And my mom, who was a psychiatrist, internal medicine, dad delivered 6,000 babies, OBGYN, but big picture person, mom was the emotional side. And combining those two are probably the most important things that I learned in terms of leadership. I learned that you've got to get market transitions right. They wait for no one. That doing the right thing too long is what causes you to die, not ensures your success.
Right.
That you've got to reinvent yourself, and it starts with the top person. Reinventing is great when it happens to you, Sue, but not when it happens to me. The leader has to be outside his or her comfort zone all the time. You've got to stay close to your customers. And Steve Jobs, there's only one of him, and there'll probably only be one of them. He just knew what to build. But most of us mere mortals, it's listening to our customers, and they will tell you what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong and what you ought to do if you know how to listen in the right way to a successful approach. And then putting the right creative resources on this reinvention and leadership, where most of us tend to put our best resources where they can generate the business for us or have the economic impact over the next 1 to 2 years. You really want your best resources thinking 3 and 5 years out. Hard for us to do, especially in today's pressure of the stock market and shareholder activism.
Absolutely, and especially with the operations has yielded the results in the past.
Yes.
And what you're saying, you have to take the risk for the future.
Oh, and what I love is when I take on a big competitor. I won't mention in the Valley, but let's say a Lucent, Alcatel, Nortel, Ericsson, that they are so comfortable with how they've been developed, and they know that they are the leaders in this whole voice industry and communications, and they know that they just are entitled to continue to lead, and that they just have to do the right thing 3 to 5% better every year. And we completely overtook the whole industry. Their market cap was 5 to 10 times what ours was. Today, ours is 5 to 10 times what all of theirs are together, because they were comfortable, because they thought they were entitled, because they weren't innovative. They didn't listen to their customers. They just kept doing the right thing with a very good development management team and good engineers, but they were too comfortable and wouldn't operate outside the box, and they were unwilling to fail. I've said the market, we do acquisitions, I think most people would agree, better than anybody in the industry, but 1 out of 3 is going to fail and crash and burn, and it's usually an ugly crash and burn. And yet when I get talked about my acquisition strategy, people beat me up on a flip camera, which many of you might have had, and they said, John, that was $600 million. What are you thinking? Didn't you know it was going to fail? If I knew it was going to fail, I wouldn't have bought it. But it didn't make it into my top 20 acquisitions. That same year, I did one for $2.1 billion and another for $2.7 billion, which were tremendously successful. And yet, I get beat up even today about how could I have blown that.
It's funny, I read an article recently, and they pointed that one out, but you did 72 or something. How many acquisitions did you do?
180 I did, and we did 14 cents. We can get a phone call on a Thursday night about an acquisition we should make from a person I respect for $3 to $4 billion. And I was embarrassed. I didn't know the name of the company. I said, what do they do? I felt better because my business development guy didn't know either. We met with him the next morning. He called me up and said, John, get over here. By 10 o'clock, I knew that our competitors were making offers to them. I had a handshake by 1 o'clock. We had it through both boards of directors, approved for $3.2 billion, announced Monday morning. Our competitors never knew what hit them. But we built a replicatable innovation process. And as we did this with 194 acquisitions, Chuck Robbins, our current CEO, doing a very good job. He basically can make a call on a Thursday night for a company that's supposed to go public. Well, it might have been a Wednesday night. Supposed to go public less than 48 hours later, and take them from thinking about going public to acquired by Cisco through both board of directors. I used to think of process as bureaucracy, and boy, was I wrong. Process done right actually speeds how you execute. And I would argue most people who are really good at innovating, reinventing themselves, develop a replicatable process. And that's what drives innovation.
Doesn't necessarily mean it's a process that is bureaucratic. It's just that you
It's the reverse.
what your decision trees are, and you can move it down quickly.
Yes, and you have a replicatable process. How do you become number one and number two in every product area? I stole that from GE, but I put a 40% minimum market share with it.
Which I
and
think
it forced
is
you to
brilliant,
think out of the box. And then we combined those products to work together while our peers were developing products in silos. And then while they were focused on data, we moved to voice. And when they moved to voice, we moved to video. When they moved to video, we moved to cloud. And when they moved to cloud, we moved to digital. And then we integrated it together. And so it's how do you get comfortable with reinventing yourself, knowing that it's going to make you very uncomfortable, but knowing it's survival for you. And making that a key part of our culture, which I think is a key part of Israel's culture.
That's excellent. So now I'm going to ask a little question here, which is something which, Israel has done relatively well. A startup nation for Israel is obvious, right? But when you look at Israel, it's also done something interesting in the military with regards to diversity. So it's women and men serve.
Yes.
In Silicon Valley, when the notion of diversity has become almost a word that no one wants to talk about, and yet everybody understands that it's a challenge. And you have been looking at this for quite some time, and in fact, actioned a certain amount of it over the last 20 years. Can you talk a little bit about what can we do? What are your insights into this particular topic?
So it's a tough one, and I don't expect everybody to agree with me, and I'll probably get beat up on some of the press. They're in this room. But I think it's a topic we have to get in front of us. If you look at it first from a purely economic sense, when you don't use all your resources, you're operating at a huge disadvantage versus your peers.
Yep.
So you look at it in a country of 8 million people, 7.5 million people in Israel. If you don't use all of your diversity, not just the men, but the women as well, and the Arab population as well, and the Christians as well, your GDP is nothing more than the size of your workforce and growing, combined with capital investment, combined with innovation. So economically, it makes no sense not to be very diverse. The U.S. did a good job of leading on this, and we were very proud in the Valley of leading. We had 30 to 40% of our board of directors women before any of our peers did, to the best of my knowledge, around the world. We always had a large percentage of our senior management at the operating committee level, probably 30% plus female. But we stalled out at about 24 or 25% gender diversity in our company, at the manager level, at the director level, at the VP level, and you know the math. 5 managers to get 1 director, 5 directors to get a VP, 5 VPs get a senior VP.
There's a lot of leakage in the system,
and
all the way
so
up.
I think we've got to rethink this. And I'm a huge backer of Sheryl Sandberg. I required every manager in Cisco to read her book, and it wasn't about the women leaning in. I actually think she was too tough on women. It was about us men leaning in and knowing that without realizing it, we discriminate. And so it's how do you really recognize you've got to change this, both it's the right thing to do for business and right thing overall, and then have the courage to change. You know what might shock you? Do you know what country in the world is focusing about education focused on gender diversity in the whole world? France.
Are you moving there? Is that
yeah,
what's going on?
and I just at times, about the time I think I've caught up to their speed, they hit me with how do we change this in the 10 to 14-year-old class? And we're developing education. Nice thing about France is they might be slow to move, but once they move at tremendous speed.
Yeah.
And they're looking at how you capture the global problem solvers in the age 10 to 14 years of age, which is where we lose the women, and making technology exciting, not something geeky that only unique guys do. And they look at how they gave us the capability. Not only did they announce digitization across the whole country with Cisco, they said, if you develop this concept for us, we'll take it across our whole nation with tremendous speed. So we're developing, focusing on diversity, 10 to 14 years of age for men, women, regardless of religion or color of skin. And they'll give us 10,000 students, then 500,000, then 3.2 million, the whole student population.
Wow.
The point that I'm making is it's constantly changing. This is a period of disrupt or be disrupted like you haven't seen before. Tremendous opportunity for us in this room, but also one that could leave us behind very quickly.
Thank you. You know, we're out of time, but we're going to do a quick lightning round. And
Okay.
this is just to close out our conversation. So as you look ahead and you can make one big bet on the future of business today, what would it be and why?
I'd make it all around digitization. This connectivity will change every aspect of our lives. It will cause us to live longer. It will cure cancer over time. It can bring potentially peace to the Middle East. And I know I'm one of the very few people who believe the best opportunity for peace is right now because of digitization and creating a middle class and startups. And I've been across all the major countries in the last year in the Middle East, and many of the leaders are coming to that conclusion. But the aspects of it around the technology and changing things hits all the hot buttons that we covered before in a very unique way. So if I were making one bet, it'd be about what role can I do in security or cloud, drones, crickets in this new environment, and realize how it will change every aspect of our lives. That would be where I would bet. And that's what I'm doing with my personal investments. I'm probably meeting with 20 groups of startups every month. I'm taking 10 to 12 companies that I will personally invest in, and it's all about getting market transitions right around these areas with a leadership team I believe in.
And you're taking board seats on some of them too.
Yes, I am.
Which is
but
quite
only when the board is 4 or 5 people, not when it's very large.
That's remarkable. That's remarkable. What about the entrepreneurial ecosystem really excites you the most today?
About the entrepreneurial?
About the entrepreneurial ecosystem really excites you most today?
It's how fast it's going to move. You know, many people, and you know, one of the lessons that I learned over time, and my dad taught me this, is you tend to deal with an entrepreneur system where you make a move or two, you poke your head up, see what your customers are doing, see what your competition is doing, make your next couple moves. The one thing that I'm perhaps most proud of that we do at Cisco is we get market transitions right, but I never let the company ever make its first move on the chessboard until we'd played out the outcome that we wanted, the worst case outcome, the best case outcome, ran it forwards and backwards, and planned out almost every move we'd make based upon what was going to occur. And this goes back to pure bureaucracy versus process.
Yeah.
We've never been beaten by another major company ever. And it isn't that we're overconfident. We sure aren't. We make Andy Grove and even Israel look not like they're paranoid. But it is the ability to not make moves a couple moves at a time, to get the market transitions right, to think like a teenager, to have no fear. And that's hard to do, especially when you get smacked and knocked down. And I have been multiple times. And sometimes we just made mistakes, but have the courage to get up, realize what you did wrong, and go forward.
Go forward. Okay, last question. What is the number one piece of advice you'd give to entrepreneurs in this audience?
Get market transitions right. Have the courage, no fear, to really understand your short, intermediate, and long-term differentiation, because if you really don't have a differentiation ahead of your peers, you don't have a company long-term. Stay close to your customers. And culture is much more a part of a company's success than I realized when I first became a CEO. Your jobs as entrepreneurs, vision and strategy for your company, develop, retain, recruit, and change your leadership team as you grow, culture, and then communicate the above. And I guess the last one would be communications. You could be a great CEO or a great leader a decade ago, or even 5 or 6 years ago, and not be good at communications. Those days are gone forever. communications, your ability to listen, position your company, handle the challenges. The CEO is the face of the company in a way it's never been done before. And I guess the last one, have fun. We're all better when we have fun, and go for it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And please give it up for John Chambers.
Thank you.